Thanks for having me. So, this is I like talking about sort of the transition from thesis to practice. It brings back a lot of good memories. It's been sort of one continuous lineage for me, and I think it was mentioned I graduated in 2005 is when I wrapped up my thesis. So I guess it's about 10 years, almost to the T. So I'm actually going to start a little before my thesis just because it's sort of all accrued for me. What will look like a very linear fashion, but I guess it wasn't quite so linear. I was very interested as a student into how to study sort of dynamic systems. I actually was an architecture student. And I was very interested in the case of the sand, the kind of rills that we were looking at before, how those were sort of a permanent cast of something that was much more kind of global and kinetic and transformative and something that was in a constant state of change. I did a lot of work personally. I was very interested in how to sort of map and study these systems. So someone like James Corner was fairly influential on me at the time of my education. So here, I also like these kind of just funny scenes from the 70s of guys. They were dumping fluorescent sand in the ocean. These are geologists. And they would essentially just, with little sticks of Vaseline, run around and actually chart where that fluorescent sand would move underwater. So you could actually start to understand the flow of sediments underwater in this sort of very analog fashion. And from that, you start to understand that there's a specific set of architectures that emerge from very dynamic kind of global systems. As a student, this was when I was in grad school, I started executing similar sort of types of studies and projects in my studios. In this case, I was doing a lot of work with plaster casting of sort of dynamic systems, and then reinserting those sort of systems into the landscape to start being able to, in my own way, start capturing those transformations of the environment, and then start thinking about how to dissect those systems and translate them into sort of forms and modes of architecture, which then became my models of design. So that became my actual sort of design projects. So as I said, as I started sort of migrating into the concept of thesis, it started for me on a sort of the world of mapping. I was just in many ways more interested in mapping and documenting complex structures of places. And most particularly what I liked about James Corner in his discussion of mappings, less so than his design work and more so his discussion of mapping, is the idea that maps are not sort of a reactionary or documentation type process, but actually a process of remaking the world and the perception of the world. So his kind of quotations, which he's saying is that mapping is as much about how you construct a perception and a legibility of the world as much as it is documenting one that exists. So every map is a way of remaking the world. And that's something I took very much to heart in my work. He, of course, uses precedents like the land artists of the 60s and 70s, someone like Richard Long, and the concept of the imposition of a mapping technique into the landscape that actually constructs new landscapes. So on one hand, sort of documenting the landscape, on the other, remaking it. I should say that when I was a student, I actually started applying for a series of, so you saw that first slide, the concept of sort of the intersection of global systems and local systems. And that was really kind of the core of my set of interests, is the notion of how do global systems and local urban environments, local pieces of architecture, become sort of part of the milieu of the global landscape. So as a student, what I was interested in was designing and developing sort of local designs and studying global systems. So I applied for a series of fellowships and grants. So I was fortunate to receive sort of a 3-year fellowship to travel and study a series of global landscapes. And what I was interested in those was, again, looking at large-scale systems and how those would essentially reconcile themselves in local urban environments. So this is obviously, well, you guys don't know, you're from Canada, but this is Utah in the United States, and this is the historic Bonneville Ocean. And essentially the Bonneville Ocean is in a constant state of evaporation, which is creating what is known as a very famous landscape in the United States, which is the Bonneville Salt Flats, which in one way seems almost like an erasure of the landscape, but on the other hand is a constantly regenerative landscape form. So this is actually a multi-million year process, which as a geologist say we are in the last second of. Right? It's in the last second of this ocean's evaporation, and you're now seeing this crust of salt emerging on the Earth. So here you're talking about something that's embedded in the kind of lineage and history of the Earth versus something like the screw dislocation, which is this is how those salt crystals are growing, is in this spiral form, which is a very microscopic crystal growth. So here you have the geologic history of the Earth, and you have the microscopic system propagating in the landscape a very unique sort of landscape form. This is my partner in the work. At the time we were just girlfriend and boyfriend, now we're married. But this is also this amazing sort of moment in American history, which is when the Transcontinental Railroad met in the United States, right? So here you see the West and the East converging at what is now known as Golden Spike, where they drove a golden spike in the ground to essentially, acknowledge the conquering of the vast United States. And of course, they targeted the Great Salt Lake because as this great ocean is evaporating, all these minerals are depositing on the earth. So you get magnesium and lithium and salt in high abundance, these great resources. So of course you put the rail line there to capitalize on it. Of course in the lake that generates new forms of infrastructure, these being oil jetties. And of course from that you start getting very intelligent artists like Robert Smithson who are able to now look at the geologic history of time, the microscopic form of salt, the creation of industrial infrastructure, and start to translate that into his own form, which is able to actually learn from all of these dynamic systems into a new form of an urban architectural vernacular that's able to sort of propagate a new landscape system. So here you see the shape of the spiral, which is an infinite geometry, though truncated by the turning radius of the truck, is actually stagnating water so that the heart of the spiral, the water turns a blood red because of the algae blooms occurring in the center of the spiral. And as it spirals out, the water becomes less and less stagnated, becoming more and more pure. And so I was interested in the capacity of industry and how industries on the lake are also capable of reenacting this sort of geologic time and amplifying this time into a new industrial process for, in fact, amplifying this evaporation of an ocean to create a product. In this case, it's water softening salts for Walmart, which you see sort of packaged against the landscape. And I'm interested in that form of intensification generates a new landscape type in terms of you're now increasing the efficiency of evaporating the ocean, and you get all these consequences as a result of that. For example, these great blooms of brine flies and their brine fly eggs, which attracts huge populations of birds, which subsequently triggers a whole ecotourism industry of people coming to look at this great bird migration pattern. So here you have this convergence of sort of global and local systems into this, odd sort of ecology, blurring the boundaries between art, industry, landscape systems. And I'm interested in someone like Rainer Banham, who was very influential in my thesis in terms of the ecologies of LA and the concept that surfing as a human response to the great kind of trajectory of the oceans, the development of the automobile, the innovations of fiberglass that were happening at the time of LA's sort of major settlement patterns, all of a sudden results in something as unique as surfing. And similarly, then, I'm interested in how this was, again, from my thesis investigations, someone like Claude Nicolas Ledoux would essentially try in a very sort of classic and, let's say, panoptic sort of sense, trying to embed the practices and systems of industry with the practices and systems of urbanism, and how he deploys these in the case of Sho to harvest this great forest as a fuel source for his ambitions. And so in that case, the industry, the city, and the sort of landscape network are all integrated together into one performance machine. As I studied industry as a student, what I was very interested in was to see, I think we're still in a period of this now, how essentially industry is something that's in many ways being evacuated from cities. The relationship between industry and cities is being disconnected. People's association, awareness, and participation with the industrial systems we participate with are becoming disconnected. So consequently, you get Port Newark adjacent to Manhattan. But I'm interested then in understanding the relationships of industry and the city. And so that was really the core of my kind of thesis investigation. Again, this is now my partner at the time. Now we're married. We're partners in Landing Studio, which we formed immediately after graduating from school. What I like, this was an image actually from one of the first days of my thesis work, which was to sort of stumble into Chelsea, Massachusetts and discover this amazing intersection of industry and the city. So this is a salt pile on the shores of Chelsea, Massachusetts. This is another site we were looking at. This is in Staten Island, New York. So this is the bus stop. And what you could start to see is so different than Smithson, who, intentionally, I would say, chose a fairly non-urban environment, though, he developed those ideas in the monuments of Passaic. But here you're looking at the sort of concept of how these industrial, these geologic, these landscape systems intersect with an urban environment and the complexities that sort of result from that urban intersection. So in this case, this is in Chelsea, Massachusetts, the reaction to that salt facility. And then on the other hand, this is someone who lives across the street who keeps a daily blog about the activities of the salt operation. So you can start to see this odd discrepancy of how an industry kind of migrates depending on its design between the notion of a monument and a blight. It's never really boring. It can never be this thing in the middle like housing and museums, things we're very used to. It sort of always gravitates to one end of the spectrum. So as a student, what I started studying was all the sort of dynamic characteristics of this landscape. To understand its role in the city, I wanted to understand how it performed. So I essentially embedded myself for a year within the salt operations and within the city of Chelsea, Massachusetts, to start looking at the sort of different aspects of this landscape to sort of understand, its global legibility, how that global legibility, for example, manifests itself in the city. So that a ship takes about 12 hours to discharge, so you could literally go to work one day and your horizon looks like this. And then if Mexico is delivered while you're at work, you might wake up the next morning, it looks like this. And then if Northern Ireland is delivered, it looks like this. So to understand this type of relationship, I spent, again, this year sort of dissecting and breaking apart the city, understanding the kind of constructed relationships that had evolved in the ecology between industry and the city. Breaking the city down. So much of Boston is a series of these glacier-deposited hills called drumlins. So everyone lives on the hills and looks down to these lowlands. So one of the first projects I undertook as a student was to actually start doing a series of light installations on the salt pile to sort of break down that kind of threshold between the industry and the city and transform that communicative nature of the industry to the city as more of almost like a community messaging board. This was actually instigated because the Red Sox went to the World Series when I was a student. So that was like a big moment. And that was very fortuitous because it sort of started creating this local dialogue between the city. So at Christmas, we would do Christmas carols. And it was interesting because there were all sorts of different reactions where the sort of editor of the newspaper was happy because, it actually illuminated the industrial corridor, which was otherwise pretty dark and scary, where other people sort of looked at it as almost like art installations. Here you see, one thing I liked about the light is these are massive landscapes. It's the size of about 6 football fields. So the idea of what's a medium that can be as adaptive and kinetic, but also as cheap. So obviously as a student, we're just no money. So how do you start to do these installations? So when it was time for the elections, for example, or high school graduation. And then it's not to say at all that the goal is ever in this case to try and sort of fix the industry. The relationship is very dynamic. It's just how do you insert yourself as a choreographer of this relationship? How do you start actually dancing as a designer within the kind of systems? So here you see it was an interesting sort of cartoon they ran in the Globe as a response to the piece. There were many, I should say, there were many like nice articles and whatnot, but I like this one because it was sort of using our system as showing how it was actually sort of being adopted as a dialogue in the city. So as a student, I was again looking at Richard Long. I started executing a series of tours, essentially, and so I would almost like on a weekly basis give myself a different way of approaching the city so that I would just try and understand the city and the systems of the city differently. So you can see I started with kayaks, then I would say I'm going to walk all the hills and I'm just going to go to the tops of all the hills. Chelsea's very tiny. It's only 2 square miles, so you could, cover the whole city pretty easily. I would visit all the mud in the city. I would essentially visit all the industrial ruins. I would do nighttime dereves to just check out the landscape at night. I would interview all of the industries in the city. And then I would start collecting all of the landmarks. And so the concept then was again, how do you start similar to what I was taking from James Corner at the time, and the concept of actually how do you not only document the city, but instigate the city? So in the work I was doing, how do I reinsert it into the city so the city tells me a little bit more? So these were some of the sort of icons that came out of that work. and the concept of then actually turning them into a communication system, again with the city. So to you, you might see the silhouette of a boxer, but anyone in Chelsea would know that that's John Ruiz, who was the last heavyweight national championship boxer from the United States, who was John Ruiz from Chelsea, Little Chelsea, Massachusetts. So a source of pride. So here's this very sort of local dialogue that we could create. So where I think my work professionally started taking off was when I really started looking into the history of the city. And I found this very odd moment in Chelsea's history where in the 1990s, Chelsea went into what is called state receivership, and it was the first city since the Great Depression to be taken into state receivership, which is essentially, it had been found to be such a politically corrupt and turbulent city that the state dissolved the local government and imposed a sort of a new management structure imposed by the state. So the school system was taken out of the hands of Chelsea and handed over to the management of Boston University. You can see the past 3 mayors were actually imprisoned. They fired 14 of the last 17 department heads. But the last line, I don't know if you can read it, was the most interesting to me, was that they hired Susan Poziba, who's a sort of public policy mediator, who actually often works between like Israel and Palestine, for example. She's a pretty intense character. But she formed a 19-member charter preparation team, and this is what caught me, between political, religious, education, and ethnic groups. So even though Chelsea was 50% zoned industrial city, I was surprised that industry was treated as this sort of outsider element of the city. It wasn't really part of the public domain, so it wasn't part of the redrafting of the city's future. So where I positioned myself in my thesis was to design a sort of a role for myself, and this was to start designing a role for myself in practice, which was the concept during state receivership is that you insert autonomous people into the city, people who have no political stake in the city, so that they can be theoretically autonomous to the kind of history of the city. So what I started designing was the concept of the autonomous agent of industry, someone who would essentially dance between the city and industry, and what would that person's role be. So you can't really see it. This was a nice big map at the time, but it was just charting my thesis and all the different influences that I thought would go into designing the autonomous agent of industry. And I tested this role out on a series of these kind of ruins in the city, these very kind of kinetic ruins, this being the old mills, which at high tide are covered over and at low tide are revealed as these land bridges. And then how could you start developing new stitches, new public access to an otherwise inaccessible waterfront? And for example, in the case of the salt yard, I sort of designed a concept for how the salt yard could be a seasonal ruin, and that in the winter it would be used for salt, but in the summer it would actually start to be used for more recreational purposes, so like events, and how could you support parking for events, versus how could you all of a sudden use that as like an AstroTurf soccer field in the summer. And it was just somewhat fortuitous. I had, of course, started a lot of dialogues with the salt company as a part of this result that essentially as soon as I graduated, this launched into my first design project in that the salt company had just acquired this oil terminal that was immediately adjacent to their property, which is that tank farm you see, which was an asphalt and jet fuel batching facility. And so the concept, they were, of course, very interested in expanding their salt operations. The city did not want salt operations. In fact, there was this big conflict between legislation. So this was Leo Mahoney. He's passed away since then, but he's who hired me on the day I graduated school, which I was very excited about. I quite liked him. He was very interesting to work for. But there was this sort of question, will the city be residential or industrial? You can see the black is industry, the gray is residential. What will the city become? The conception was the city couldn't possibly be both, even though that's what it's historically been. And so my interest, sort of picking off the thesis and continuing to this work, was how do you start to balance these different competing interests of the waterfront, from industry to recreation to ecologic system. That's a harbor seal. He's alive. He's not dead. So we, again, some of the first projects we did were actually to start picking up on the thesis concepts. How do we actually start transitioning the summertime programming of this landscape, in this case to support a series of events? We then migrated that concept to New York, where we actually started to install on a different salt dock there a series of these sort of performance art and film festivals. How do we actually start to embed the capacity of the industry into the performance of the city? So this has now been referred to as sort of Staten Island. We do this every other year now on the salt dock in Staten Island. We get about 7,000 people for a one-night event where essentially we construct these salt landscapes for artists to, we have about 60 international and New York-based artists doing installations, manipulating these landscapes that we build for them. And the main project that evolved from this, so once the kind of proof of concept had been established and we'd been able to do these types of events, which picked up from the concept of the thesis, how do we then expand this idea into the redevelopment strategy for this oil terminal? And at that point, I think we had managed to convince the owners that there was ways we could start sort of feathering these different uses together, both in a seasonal way but also a permanent way. That what were previously sort of prohibitive legislations, could we start to actually find ways that we could overlap those systems and create sort of compromise? So just to give a sense of where that work essentially led, was the reconfiguration of this oil terminal into a shared landscape of salt storage facilities, public park, and then a seasonal flex area, which in the winter is used as an expansion zone of the industry and is in the summer used for public recreation. Again, this was taken as a fairly sort of skeptical concept at first in the city. Didn't maybe seem possible. It took us, from the time I graduated, it took 7 years to do the permitting for this project. So it was a very long, that's longer than your entire academic tenure perhaps, which was, a lesson for me, I suppose, in how sort of patient you have to be. This being some of the designs, some of the negotiations in terms of how we actually would start stockpiling and storing salt in the future. We actually had to develop 2 entirely different drawing sets, one for the city, which promoted the concept of recreation and ecology and public landscape, and one for the state and the national government, which was about preserving maritime industry. And then we just opened that landscape now 2 years ago, which is now you're seeing the kind of seasonal transformation of the site from its wintertime use to its summertime use. Part of that project, again, I think what was critical in the design of the autonomous agent was the concept of designing a role that wasn't sort of the convention of architects where you sort of execute your project and leave. So I've been working with this company ever since I graduated school. We sometimes refer to it as almost like an architect in residency. And the concept then is to actually design more of a choreographed relationship as opposed to specific projects. So throughout the duration of this project, while it was a 10-year-long period, we did all sorts of sort of, the point of this was to make the concept that the waterfront of Chelsea hasn't been accessible for 100 years. It's just been inaccessible to the public. It's a complete industrial wall. So this is the first waterfront access point built on Chelsea's waterfront for 100 years, was to find this compromise. So as a point of trying to sort of reinitiate and re-engage the community with the waterfront, how do we actually sort of animate and engage the systems that were sort of translating the landscape? And in this case, how do we actually just literally translate the capacity? And again, as a choreographer as opposed to an architect, what was nice is we can actually embed ourselves in the systems of the industry and actually start sort of choreographing their systems. So this was a project where for one day we noticed that they were scrapping this great old tugboat across the way in East Boston, and we were able to negotiate a trade where we could take the cabin of the tugboat for our park. So we sort of decapitated it and took it and then turned that into a classroom in the park that we were building. And then throughout the years, just how we were essentially salvaging the different components of the landscape, turning those into new elements, obviously trying to create new relationships in the landscape. Thank you.